You wake up to the sound of church bells echoing across a half-empty village. It's a crisp morning in 3052, and as you stretch in your straw-filled mattress, you notice something that would have been unthinkable just 5 years ago. Silence where there should be voices. The house next door, which once buzzed with the laughter of the Miller family's 6 children, stands eerily quiet. Its wooden shutters hang slightly askew, and weeds have begun to creep up the stone foundation. But here's the thing that might surprise you about this moment. Despite everything that's happened, despite the unimaginable loss that swept through Europe like a dark tide, there's something else in the air this morning. Something that feels almost like possibility. You step outside your cottage and the first thing that hits you isn't the sight of devastation you might expect. It's the smell. Instead of the usual cocktail of human waste, rotting food, and unwashed bodies that typically assaulted your medieval nostrils, the air seems cleaner somehow, less crowded. There are fewer people, yes, but that also means fewer people packed into spaces that were never meant to hold so many. The Black Death, or as you would have known it, simply the pestilence or the great mortality, swept through your world between 30. Historians still debate the exact numbers. Some say it killed 1/3 of Europe's population, others argue it was closer to 60% in some regions. But you don't think in statistics. You think in faces, in empty chairs at communal tables, in fields that used to wave with grain but now grow wild with poppies and thistles. As you walk through your village this morning, you notice Thomas the blacksmith's forge is already roaring to life. Thomas survived, though his wife and 2 of his 3 sons didn't. He's one of the lucky ones, if you can call anyone lucky after what you've all been through. But here's what's fascinating. Thomas isn't just surviving anymore. He's actually starting to thrive in ways that would have been impossible before the plague. You stop at Thomas's forge and he greets you with a confidence you've never seen in him before. "Good morning," he calls out, wiping soot from his hands with a cloth that's actually clean. Another small luxury that's become possible recently. "I've got your horseshoe ready. And I've got to tell you, I'm charging twice what my father used to charge." This might sound shocking, but here's the thing historians find so fascinating about the post-plague period. For the first time in centuries, ordinary working people like Thomas had bargaining power. Before the Black Death, Europe was overpopulated relative to its agricultural capacity. There were too many people competing for too few jobs. Peasants and craftsmen had to accept whatever wages lords and merchants offered, because there was always someone more desperate willing to work for less. But now Thomas is one of only 2 blacksmiths left in a region that once had 7. The surviving horses still need shoes. The remaining farmers still need their tools repaired. The demand hasn't disappeared. It's just concentrated among fewer providers. As you watch Thomas work, you notice he's wearing boots made of actual leather, not the wooden clogs or cloth wrappings that most smiths wore in the old days. His workshop is better organized, with proper tools hanging from hooks on the walls instead of scattered in corners. He's even hired an apprentice, young William, whose master died of the plague last year. "The thing is," Thomas explains as he shapes the hot iron, "I can afford to be selective now. Lord Edmund wants his horses shod. He pays my price or he takes his business elsewhere. But where's he going to go? Master Richard in the next village over charges even more than I do." You leave Thomas's forge and walk toward the manor house where you're due to help with the harvest. But as you walk, you notice something that would have been unthinkable before the plague. Several fields that clearly belong to the lord's domain are being worked by people you recognize as former serfs. They're not sneaking around or looking over their shoulder. They're working openly, confidently, as if they have every right to be there. Here's where the story gets really interesting, and where historians have spent centuries trying to untangle the social revolution that followed the plague. The feudal system that had dominated Europe for centuries was built on a simple premise. Lots of poor people who needed land to survive, controlled by a few wealthy people who owned all the land. Peasants were tied to the soil, bound by law and custom to work their lord's land in exchange for protection and the right to farm small plots for their own survival. But what happens when suddenly a third to half of those peasants are gone? You encounter Margaret on your way to the field. Before the plague, Margaret was a serf, bound to Lord Edmund's estate. She couldn't leave without permission, couldn't marry without paying a fee, couldn't even grind her grain anywhere except the Lord's mill, which charged exorbitant rates. But Margaret survived the plague when so many didn't, and now she's working a plot of land 3 villages over. How did you manage that, you ask her, genuinely curious. Margaret smiles, and you realize it's the first time you've ever seen her smile with her whole face. Lord Peter, over in Westbrook, offered me 15 acres and a cottage if I'd come work his land. 15 acres. My grandfather never dreamed of farming 15 acres, and if I don't like the arrangement after 7 years, I can leave. This is the great paradox of the post-plague period. The Black Death was arguably the worst catastrophe in human history to that point, but it also accidentally created the conditions for one of the most significant improvements in living standards for common people that Europe would see until the Industrial Revolution. You arrive at Lord Edmund's manor, and immediately you can see the strain the new economic reality is putting on the old aristocracy. The Great Hall, which once buzzed with dozens of servants, retainers and guests, feels cavernous and underpopulated. Lord Edmund himself greets you at the door, something that never would have happened before the plague. Lords didn't greet common laborers, they barely acknowledged their existence. But Lord Edmund needs you now in a way he never did before. The vast estates that made the nobility wealthy were only profitable when there were enough peasants to work them. Now, with the population decimated, lords across Europe were facing a choice: adapt to the new reality, or watch their lands go fallow and their power crumble. I need to discuss your wages, Lord Edmund says, and you can hear the discomfort in his voice. Wages. Before the plague, most peasants didn't receive wages at all. They worked the Lord's land in exchange for the right to farm their own small plots. Money rarely changed hands at the village level. I'm prepared to offer you 3 shillings a week, plus meals, plus the right to graze 2 cows on the common land. He continues. 3 shillings a week was what a skilled craftsman might have earned before the plague. Now it's what Lord Edmund has to pay just to get his fields harvested. As you negotiate, and the very fact that you're negotiating with a lord is revolutionary, you notice other changes around the manor. The stone walls that once seemed so imposing now show signs of neglect. There aren't enough servants to maintain everything properly. Weeds grow between the cobblestones in the courtyard. One of the towers has scaffolding around it, but the repair work has been abandoned halfway through. After finishing your work at the manor, you decide to make the journey to the nearest city, something you've been contemplating for months now. Before the plague, cities were death traps. They were overcrowded, filthy, disease-ridden places where life expectancy was even lower than in the countryside. The urban poor lived packed into tenements and basements, surviving on scraps and hope. But now, as you approach the city gates, you see something remarkable. There are actually spaces between the buildings, gardens where tenements used to stand. The streets, while still far from clean by modern standards, don't reek with the same overwhelming stench of human misery that characterized medieval urban life. You meet a man named Peter at an inn near the city center. Peter was a carpenter before the plague, one of dozens in the city competing for work. Now he's not just a carpenter. He's a master carpenter with his own workshop, 3 apprentices and enough work to keep them all busy for months. The guilds tried to stop us at first, Peter explains as you share a meal that includes actual meat, another small luxury that's become more accessible since the plague. They wanted to maintain the old restrictions, keep the number of masters artificially low. But how do you enforce guild restrictions when half the guild members are dead? and the other half are too busy to police everyone else. This breakdown of guild restrictions was happening across Europe. The craft guilds had functioned as medieval labor unions, but they were also exclusive clubs that limited opportunity for most workers. The guild system worked when there were more people than jobs, but in a world where skilled workers were suddenly scarce, the old restrictions began to crumble. You notice something else unusual in the city: the number of women running shops and workshops. This is Alice, who took over her husband's bakery when he died of the plague. Before the catastrophe, the law and custom would have forced Alice to find another man to run the business or sell it to a male relative. But there simply aren't enough men to maintain those restrictions now. Alice has not only kept the bakery running, she's expanded it. She's hired 2 assistants and started making sweet pastries alongside the usual bread, luxuries that reflect the strange new prosperity that some survivors are experiencing. "I won't lie to you," Alice says as she kneads dough with practiced efficiency. "It wasn't easy at first. The guild tried to shut me down, said women couldn't be master bakers. But when half the city is going hungry and I'm the only one with grain connections and the skills to turn it into bread, suddenly those rules start to seem a bit silly, don't they?" The post-plague period saw an unprecedented increase in women's economic participation across Europe. Not because medieval society became more progressive in its attitudes toward women, but because survival trumped ideology. When there weren't enough men to fill all the economic roles that society needed, pragmatism overcame prejudice. As evening approaches, you find yourself in the city's cathedral for Vespers. The church is still the center of community life, but even here, changes are evident. The massive space that once overflowed with worshippers now feels almost intimate with its smaller congregation. The priest, Father Benedict, speaks to you after the service. "I won't pretend it's been easy," he says, his voice carrying the weight of someone who has blessed too many graves, comforted too many dying souls. "There are nights when I question everything: my faith, God's plan, the meaning of suffering. But then I see how the survivors care for each other, how they've learned to value each day, each meal, each moment of health and safety. And I think perhaps this is what resurrection looks like." The psychological impact of the Black Death on survivors is something historians are still trying to understand. These were people who had watched their entire world collapse and rebuild itself in the span of a few years. They had seen death on a scale that was almost incomprehensible. Yet they not only survived but found ways to create better lives for themselves and their children. Some historians argue that the plague created a kind of collective trauma that changed European culture permanently. Others suggest it unleashed a new kind of individualism, a recognition that life was precious and shouldn't be wasted in unnecessary suffering. Both perspectives might be true. You notice this complexity in the survivors you meet. There's a kind of practical wisdom in their approach to life now. They save money, but they also spend it on small pleasures that their parents might have considered frivolous. They plan for the future, but they also seem more present in their daily lives. They take their faith seriously, but they also question authorities that failed them during the crisis. The next morning you join a group of peasants heading out to harvest the fields around the city. What you see there would be remarkable to anyone familiar with medieval agriculture. Fields that are better maintained, crops that look healthier, and farming techniques that seem more advanced than what was common before the plague. Here's what happened. With fewer people to feed, farmers could afford to let some fields lie fallow longer, restoring their fertility. They could invest time in improving their tools and techniques rather than just maximizing immediate yield. Most importantly, they could afford to experiment. You meet Robert, who is trying something his father would have considered insanely risky. He's growing legumes in rotation with his grain crops. "My grandfather would roll over in his grave," Robert laughed. "He always said you plant grain where grain grows and vegetables where vegetables grow. and you don't get clever about it. But I've got enough land now that I can afford to experiment with one field. If it doesn't work, I won't starve. This kind of agricultural innovation was happening across Europe. The pressure to maximize every square foot of farmland had eased, creating space for the kind of experimentation that would eventually lead to more productive farming methods. Historians call this the beginning of the agricultural improvements that would support Europe's later population growth and economic development. As you work alongside the other harvesters, you start to notice patterns among the survivors that raise fascinating questions. Why did some people survive when others didn't? Was it just random chance? Or were there factors that influenced survival rates? You notice that many of the survivors seem to be people who lived on the margins of medieval society, people who lived in isolated farms rather than crowded villages, people whose work kept them moving rather than staying in one place, people who for whatever reason had less contact with the trade routes and urban centers where the plague spread fastest. There's Martin, who survived because he was a traveling tinker, never staying in one place long enough to be exposed to a major outbreak. There's Sarah, whose family lived on a remote farm and who had limited contact with the outside world during the worst years of the plague. There's young David, who survived as a child while his parents died, possibly because children's immune systems responded differently to the disease. But you also notice social patterns. The plague killed rich and poor alike, but it didn't kill them equally. The wealthy had better nutrition, better housing, and more ability to flee infected areas. Some noble families survived almost intact while entire peasant villages were wiped out. Yet even among the wealthy, mortality was high enough to disrupt the established social order. The church bells that woke you this morning carry a different tone than they did before the plague. The Catholic Church, which had been the unquestioned spiritual and temporal authority in medieval Europe, faced its own crisis during and after the Black Death. You've lived through a period when priests died alongside their congregations, when monasteries were abandoned, when the Church's explanations for suffering seemed inadequate to the scale of catastrophe. In the village chapel, you notice changes that reflect this spiritual upheaval. There are new religious paintings on the walls, but they're different from the old ones. Where medieval religious art once emphasized hierarchy, divine order, and the glory of suffering for God, the new paintings focus more on human compassion, divine mercy, and the promise of resurrection. These aren't theological changes exactly, but they reflect a shift in how people want to think about their relationship with God. Father Benedict tells you about the theological debates that have consumed church scholars since the plague. Some argue that the pestilence was God's punishment for human sin, he explains. Others say it was a test of faith, like Job's suffering. Still others suggest that God doesn't cause such suffering but permits it for reasons we cannot understand. What's most remarkable is that he's discussing these theological questions with you at all. Before the plague, ordinary lay people weren't considered capable of understanding such matters, but the crisis forced everyone to grapple with ultimate questions about life, death, and meaning. The result was a more democratized approach to religious thinking that would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation. 2 centuries later, you spend the afternoon in the city's workshops, marveling at the innovations that have emerged from necessity. With fewer people available to do manual labor, survivors have been forced to find more efficient ways of doing things. You watch as a miller demonstrates a new type of windmill design that can be operated by fewer people but processes grain more efficient. Before the plague, we had enough hands that efficiency didn't matter so much, the miller explains. If something took 10 men to operate, you found 10 men. Now if I can't operate my mill with 3 people, I go out of business. This pressure to do more with less was driving technological innovation across Europe. Water-powered machinery became more sophisticated. Agricultural tools were improved to require less human labor. Even in areas like bookmaking, innovations were emerging. The printing press was still a century away, but scribes were developing more efficient methods of copying texts to meet demand with fewer personnel. You also notice innovations in social organization.
The guilds that survived the plague were experimenting with new training methods that could produce skilled workers more quickly. Trade associations were developing new ways of sharing knowledge and resources. Even military organizations were adapting, developing tactics that could be effective with smaller forces. As evening approaches, you find yourself in the home of William, a merchant who has become wealthy by adapting quickly to post-plague economic opportunity. His house reflects the complex cultural changes of this period. The walls are decorated with art, but it's different from the religious imagery that dominated medieval homes.
Some of the paintings still have religious themes, but they're more humanistic, more focused on individual experience and emotion. There are also secular images, landscapes, portraits of family members, even some mythological scenes inspired by classical antiquity. This isn't quite the Renaissance yet, but you can see its seeds in this new interest in human experience and classical learning. I commissioned these paintings not just for decoration, William explains, but because I want my children to understand that there's beauty in the world worth preserving. We've seen so much death, so much destruction. I want them to know that humans can create beautiful things, meaningful things. This cultural shift was happening across Europe. The proximity of death made life more precious, but it also made art and beauty more important. People who had survived the worst catastrophe in human memory wanted to celebrate what it meant to be human, to be alive, to create something lasting. You attend a wedding in the village church, something that's become much more common recently. Before the plague, marriage was often delayed because young people couldn't afford to establish independent households. Now, with more opportunities for employment and more abandoned properties available, couples are marrying younger and more frequently. But you notice that these post-plague marriages seem different from the formal economic arrangements that were common before. There's more emphasis on companionship, on mutual support, on building something together. Perhaps when you've lived through the possible end of everything, the relationships that matter most are those based on genuine affection and partnership. The bride, Catherine, lost her first husband and 2 children to the plague. The groom, James, lost his wife and parents. Their marriage is partly practical, 2 survivors pooling resources to build a better life. But you can see real tenderness between them. They've both learned how precious and fragile happiness can be. We've decided not to wait for anything, Catherine tells you after the ceremony. If we want children, we'll have children now. If we want to travel to see James's brother in the next county, we'll do it this year. If we want to build a larger house, we'll start building it next month. We've learned that tomorrow isn't guaranteed. The local monastery library has become a fascinating place since the plague. Brother Francis, one of the few surviving monks, has been working to preserve the monastery's collection of books and manuscripts. But he's also been thinking about which knowledge is most important to save and transmit. Before the plague, we had dozens of monks copying texts, preserving everything. Brother Francis explains as he shows you through the library. We copied theological treatises, philosophical debates, commentaries on commentaries. Now, with just a few of us left, we have to be more selective. We focus on practical knowledge, medicine, agriculture, engineering, alongside the spiritual texts. This pragmatic approach to education was emerging across Europe. Schools that survived the plague began emphasizing practical skills alongside traditional learning. The curriculum started including more mathematics, more natural philosophy, what we would call science, more practical training for crafts and trades. You notice that literacy is also spreading in unexpected ways. With fewer priests available to read and write for their congregations, more lay people are learning to read. With more economic opportunities available, basic numeracy and record-keeping skills have become valuable. Education is becoming more democratized not because authorities planned it that way, but because survival demands it. As your day in the post-plague world winds down, you reflect on all the economic changes you've witnessed. The old feudal system, where everyone had a fixed place in a rigid hierarchy, is giving way to something more fluid and dynamic. Money is becoming more important than land as a source of power and security. You think about Thomas the blacksmith charging higher prices, Alice the baker expanding her business, Margaret working land in a different village under better terms. These aren't just individual success stories. They represent a fundamental shift in how European society organizes its economic life. Historians debate whether this transition would have happened without the Black Death, or whether the plague simply accelerated changes that were already beginning. What's clear is that the demographic collapse created opportunities for social mobility that hadn't existed for centuries. People who survived could improve their circumstances in ways that would have been impossible in the overcrowded world before the plague. This economic dynamism came with costs, of course. The security of the old feudal system, where everyone had a place and role even if it was humble, was replaced by a more competitive system, where individual success depended more on skill, luck, and initiative. But for many survivors, the opportunity to control their own economic destiny was worth the increased uncertainty. As you prepare for sleep in your medieval cottage, it's worth considering how the world you've experienced today contains the seeds of the modern era. The emphasis on individual rights and economic opportunity, the questioning of traditional authorities, the focus on practical education and technological innovation. These are all developments that will eventually contribute to the Renaissance, the Reformation, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment. The Black Death was one of the worst catastrophes in human history, but it also accidentally created conditions for some of the most positive developments in European civilization. This doesn't mean the plague was good, or that the suffering it caused was justified by later improvements. It simply means that humans are remarkably adaptable, and that even the worst circumstances can create unexpected opportunities for positive change. The people you've met today, Thomas and Alice and Margaret and all the others, didn't set out to revolutionize European society. They were just trying to survive, to rebuild, to create better lives for themselves and their children. But their individual choices and adaptations, multiplied across thousands of communities, added up to one of the most significant social transformations in human history. As you lie in your straw bed, listening to the silence that still feels strange after so many years of overcrowding, you might reflect on what you've learned about human resilience. The people of medieval Europe faced something that seemed like the end of the world, and yet they found ways not just to survive, but to build something better from the ruins. This isn't to romanticize their suffering or minimize the tragedy of what they lost. The Black Death was a catastrophe of almost unimaginable proportions. Families were destroyed, communities vanished, centuries of accumulated knowledge and culture were lost forever. The pain and grief of the survivors was real and lasting. But alongside that pain, there was also growth. The survivors developed new skills, new ways of organizing society, new approaches to work and family, and community. They learned to value life more highly, because they had seen how quickly it could be lost. They learned to question authority, because the old authorities had failed to protect them. They learned to adapt and innovate because survival demanded it. In many ways, the world you've experienced today, with its emphasis on individual opportunity, technological innovation, and social mobility, is more recognizable to modern audiences than the world that existed before the plague. The Black Death didn't cause the modern world, but it helped clear away some of the obstacles that prevented positive change. As you drift off to sleep in your medieval cottage, you can take comfort in knowing that the human capacity for resilience and growth is stronger than even the worst catastrophes. The people you've met today faced challenges that would test anyone's faith in the future. Yet they found ways to create hope, beauty,
and opportunity from devastation. Their story reminds us that even in the darkest times, humans find ways to care for each other, to build something better, to pass on wisdom and love to the next generation. The bells that wake you each morning ring not just to mark the hours, but to celebrate the simple fact that there are still people alive to hear them, still communities gathered to work and worship and dream together. The world of 3052 was harsh by modern standards, full of dangers and uncertainties that we can barely imagine. But it was also full of people who had learned to appreciate simple pleasures, to value genuine relationships, to find meaning in work well done and communities well served. In their own way, they had discovered some of the secrets of a life well lived. Sleep well, knowing that the human story is one of resilience, adaptation and hope, even in the face of the greatest challenge. The people who rebuilt Europe after the Black Death would be proud to know that their legacy of courage and ingenuity continues to inspire us today.